I want to pivot really quickly to myth. You talked about the mythological relationship you have with Bruce and how you'd like to keep him that way. Bruce Springsteen's music is mythological and archetypical. And
Mhm.
my favorite example is the song The River, which is the closest any pop artist has ever come to writing a folk song. It's truly astounding how much it sounds like it could have been written hundreds of years ago. Um, do
Hmm.
you find common ground in that aspect of his work?
I don't know. It's funny, like this line of questioning is really interesting, and I'll be thinking about it after you go away because um I don't think of my work as being especially like Bruce's. I have this one picture book called it's called Night on the Highway, Some Rules for the Road. And it's just about a kid sitting in a car as sort of a car is going down the highway, and it explains to you what the highway is. That I've often thought of as like my Bruce Springsteen picture book. I haven't sold it, so you'll never read it, um, but it's just sort of about it's a more sort of what you pass, the sort of things, the experience of being in a car on a highway and sort of what you encounter and where you go and whether or not you get anywhere. Um, so I haven't really thought about those parallels very much. I I think on some level, like I don't want to, I'm afraid I've made such a mess visually in this interview that I don't want to pull the book down and make another mess. But I have these binders, these big red binders that have printed copies of all the picture books that I haven't published.
Uh-huh.
And they are full of me making a mess of trying new things um, that aren't going to work. Uh, I think range is really important to me. The idea that I'm always trying something brand new.
Mm.
Um,
Kind of like Bruce, trying to reinvent yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing that feels like a parallel to me is like I want to think that in those notebooks, and maybe someday I'll come back to those things and revise them, but that there are picture books or novel beginnings or essays that are, folk songs and that are punk songs and that are, or, they're not, but like that represent the same energy as those things that are mythology, that are, you know, list, that are recipe, that are uh I don't know, like I had a picture book come out this year that's a choose your own adventure format picture book. Um, and like because something I hadn't done before, that I'm always trying to figure out something I haven't done before. And I do think that that's in Bruce. Like I think if you read his autobiography, you sort of see he is always growing and changing and sort of digging into himself and unpacking and trying to figure out his demons and all of that stuff.
Yeah, especially his relationship with his father, which in his autobiography is central.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and mine too. I mean, like, I think that's also a thing in me. The sort of father-daughter relationship is important in my work for sure.
He found closure in that relationship. If you don't mind my asking, did you?
It's funny you asked that. The answer would have been different a couple of years ago. My dad came and lived with us last year for a couple of months.
Oh, wow.
And I love my father very much. He's a wonderful man. And but he moved out when I was 8 and we never lived together full time after that. And I think there's something that happens when you have a relationship with somebody and then they're not sort of the relationship is fractured in that way. And I think I carried a lot of weight and a lot of melancholy and sort of nostalgia, and all got mixed up together. And it all got mixed up with Bruce. And then last year he came and stayed because Georgia has been the most exciting place to be politically for the last 5 or 6 years. And we're all exhausted.
Yeah.
But we've all, as you know, we've all been knocking doors and marching and doing like I was not trained to be a poll watcher until I moved to Georgia, and then all of this happened the last few years. Um, and I think my dad, who's deeply political, and I was raised in a very, very political socialist household, where we were always working for some candidate or knocking doors or whatever. I think from a distance, he's in Baltimore, and it does not have the same power to be in a place that's so blue and so safe for a Democrat. And he was sort of watching me through Abrams and Warnock and Ossoff and like all of that. And so last fall, he found a candidate that he wanted to work for, a state congressman, a state legislator, up in Lumpkin County, and came and moved into my house and was driving back and forth to North Georgia every day to knock doors and canvas for this guy. So so the point of that is, it was really interesting to have him here daily. That it really makes you realize the difference between the way you, maybe to go back full circle to the celebrity thing. With Bruce, I like the idea of holding him at arm's length. I wouldn't want to know I don't want to resolve my feelings for Bruce, right? Like, I like them the way they are. And with my dad, I didn't realize how beneficial it would be to just, have breakfast together every day, and get annoyed when, whatever, he locked his keys in the car, or just those things that were not about personality or father-daughter relationship or divorce or distance or getting older, any of that kind of big picture stuff. It was just like I thought you were going to pick up the turkey at the grocery store, like that kind of familial relationship. So I actually do feel like in the last 2 years, all the things that felt raw are not raw anymore. I actually just talked to him like an hour before I talked to you. I called him because I hadn't talked to him in a couple of weeks. And yeah, so I think in a lot of ways we have healed things, whatever it was. I'm not sure it needed healing, but it's different.
Now, I happen to know, because I know you a little bit, that you are also, or have been, a songwriter. I hope you don't mind my bringing this up.
No, it's funny. I'm actually doing another podcast this week where she asked if we could use my songs on the intro and outro, and I was like, oh my gosh, nobody wants to hear that. But yes, I went through a period. My training is in poetry, and I went to school at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, which is this poetry MFA program in the middle of nowhere, Iowa City, Iowa, which I loved. And I ended up, I don't mean middle of nowhere in a bad way. Like, I ended up staying for an extra 5 years and buying a house and marrying somebody from Iowa City. And, but my world there was full of, as it still is, was full of musicians. And the process of going through that MFA program really shut me down as a writer. And so I found myself kind of unable to make poetry, but surrounded by people who were songwriters. And so it's kind of bled into me. And I was going to shows all the time. There were guitars everywhere, as there are always in my life, guitars everywhere, even though I can't really play it. And so I wrote this demo of songs, and then some friends came over and we, recorded it.
Yeah, I heard them. I really liked them.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll admit, I listen back to them now. There are a couple of that I didn't put online because they have not aged well.
Sure.
I was a waitress, and I had a very jaunty attitude about maybe the male gaze, and for a 50-year-old mother and children's author, those songs didn't feel right to place in the world. But yeah, I look back at them and I'm kind of proud of myself. Like, if for no other reason, that I tried something I had no idea what I was doing. But again, I'm just making a mess. Like, that's sort of, I kind of plow through the world and I try things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work. And I'm really, really grateful that I still have that artifact. That listening to it, I remember my 25-year-old self in a way that I don't think I would be able to do if I didn't have that. And that's what music does, right? Like like I could listen to a Leonard Cohen song, or I listen to a John Fogerty song, or I listen to a Lauryn Hill song, or whatever, and I'm in a totally different chapter of my life. And it is time travel. It is just, there's so much sense memory stuff that happens with music. And so to hear my own younger voice played back at me, with my friends backing vocals and my other friend's guitar playing, and suddenly I'm like in my friend Kelly's basement, with a whiskey in my hand, in a way that does not really match my life today.
You've described yourself as a poet pretending to write novels. Was that also the case with songs? Were you a poet pretending to write songs, or were you really into the song idea?
I think I was a poet pretending to write songs. It is not a form I think I, as a writer, had explored or understood. And I remember at some point talking to my now husband, who at the time was not my husband, about what was something that was bothering me about my songs. And he was like, "You're using too many words." And he sort of was trying to explain phrasing to, like, musical phrasing to me. And I realized it's just like I can draw a picture, but I don't understand line. I don't understand color theory. I don't understand, you know, my friend, somebody who's doing one of my picture books in the future, my friend Lei Wen Pham. I just got to see her do a presentation where she was explaining like the visual language of a spread in a book, and sort of the difference between, like, if you have something large on the left side, like the way that it moves and how large things and small things interact with it, like maternal shapes and male or feminine and masculine shapes, like all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is like a whole new thing that I don't know anything about. That doesn't mean I couldn't sit down and draw a picture, but I don't know that language. I think I didn't know that. I obviously we're all music fans. Everybody's a music fan, and I love music, and I can karaoke with the best of them. But I don't understand music. And so I was taking what I knew about poetry and laying it on top of the idea of a song. And that doesn't mean that in some ways you do really interesting work when you don't speak the language, right? Like, it's in some ways, I think the people who make the best children's books are often people who are brand new to it because they don't know what the rules are yet. So they break them all. Like, they just do interesting, innovative stuff. And I think it's entirely possible that that can happen too. But I definitely felt, I was playing at, I don't understand keys and chords and, none of it. Yeah. So I definitely felt like a phony in that way. I basically am a poet who writes fiction. I'm a poet who writes picture books. I'm a poet who writes essays. I'm a poet who writes songs. Like, I'm a poet who writes grocery lists. Like I think in the craft tools of poetry, and then I try to figure out how to apply them to the form that I'm messing around with. And I always feel a little bit like a dilettante in that way. But I'm happy there. Like, that's it. I'm fine there. I don't think I will ever master another form.
Are you a poet who writes
Not,
poems?
not as much as I sometimes struggle with that, like, I think that this is just real talk. It is a hard thing when you start getting paid for something and you typically have not gotten paid for what you do. It's very hard to prioritize the things you don't get paid for when somebody else is waiting for a document. Like, I should be finishing this novel, or I should be writing the next picture book because my kids are going to start going to college and I need to make a living. And poetry was always something that I had always assumed that I would be a waitress or a grant writer or a whatever else, substitute teacher, whatever, and write on the side. And then that changed, and I became a professional writer who makes a living doing this. And it's much easier to be a waitress who carves out time for poetry than it is to be somebody who spends all day writing a novel and then tries to find the energy and the steam for a poem. Largely because the ideas are all going into the thing I'm doing, that, like, I'm still having the same responses to the world. I'm still noticing things and translating the world into the language that I play with, but then I'm using it. So if I've already, if I'm walking down the street and I see, I don't know, a dog carrying a purple scarf in its mouth, and if I were in poetry brain, my brain would start to spin on that image, and I would maybe turn into a poem. And instead I go home and the scene that I am working on is going to have a dog with a purple scarf in its mouth. And it's like I've already used up what I noticed.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Um, oh, is there a deeper connection between music and the writing of words than most people realize?
So when I made that series of songs, I was in my final semester at Iowa, and I had a teacher named Jim Galvin. And it had become this whole thing for me at that point. Like, I wasn't really writing poems at the time, largely because the program had kind of broken me. I'd been very intimidated. it's a fancy program, and everybody there was from Harvard or Yale or Stanford. And I had come from University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I saw myself as like the diner waitress hanging out with the Ivy League kids. And it really had sort of taken something away from me with poetry. And I came back to poetry, and I continued to write poetry for years and years after that. But for that window of time, I was really struggling with how to write it and how to share it, like sort of in this environment, which is a big part of why I started trying to write both picture books and music, is that I needed somewhere to put the dog with the purple scarf in his mouth, right? Like if I'm not going to write a poem, I got to do something else with it. Just because that's my, like I said, I'm an external processor. That's my nature. And I went, two things happened. One is that I had to give my final reading. There was this bar in town called the Mill, and there was a reading series there, and all the sort of graduating students would give their final Mill reading, like a full-length poetry reading. And I had to do my final workshop, and I just didn't have any poems. And I felt everybody had seen my old work. I was embarrassed, and all the new stuff that I was making was not poetry in the way that this world saw poetry. And so I ended up taking a song to my final workshop and submitting it. And I've rarely been as scared as I was that day. Like it just felt like these are the people that I was ashamed to, like, I felt like they didn't respect my poetry. Well, what are they going to do when I bring in this country song? And so I asked him about it in advance. I said, is this okay? I'm going to bring in this rhymed, metered, formal, structured, refrains. And he said, yes. And I will forever be grateful to Jim Galvin for this. I went into class that day, and it was my turn to be up. And instead of reading the poem, I said, okay, so I have this other thing. It's not really a poem, it's a song. And he did this wonderful sort of mini talk before we workshopped it. And the workshop didn't go especially well because nobody knew what to do with it, because it didn't follow the rules of what they were used to critiquing. But he played Greg. There's a singer-songwriter named Greg Brown, who's an Iowa guy, who's actually one of my best friend's parents, dad. But he's a big deal in Iowa City. He's like their local musician. And I think he probably knew Jim, and Jim probably knew him. But he recorded a CD years and years ago that was a musical version of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. And so Jim played that, or some of that, and then stopped it. And I'll never forget, he said, and I've used this in other things since, like written it into essays. He said, "Stand by your man and tell the world you love him is not a poem until you add the steel guitar." And we had this very interesting conversation about internal and external music, and why songs and poems are not the same, and sort of how they do the same work, and how they achieve what they achieve. And then we sort of were able to then, he was a really good teacher. And then we were able to sort of use that as a way of then talking about like what I had put on, like what I had put on the page. And, we sort of couldn't workshop it as a song, but we also couldn't really workshop it as a poem. So that happened. And then at some point, I don't remember which came first. Probably the reading came first, but I had to go give this reading where I was, theoretically going to read like 10 poems or something. And I decided that I wasn't going to do it like that. And I had my friends come join me on stage, and we had the only concert I ever gave of my songs. But it was this magical experience of standing there on stage with my friends and singing. And I think what I would say is, I don't think I'm a songwriter, but I don't think I wanted to be a songwriter. That wasn't my goal. I really would have liked to have been in a band, like just that feeling. During the pandemic, I bought a drum kit, which has always felt like if I were really going to play an instrument, that's what I would play. And, Chris plays bass and guitar, and Lewis and Mose had taken a little bit of guitar and a little bit of piano, and my kids. And so there were some pandemic sort of family band kind of attempts, let's say, or I would just go down there with a beer and bang on the drums at night when I was feeling frustrated. But I think that the social dynamic of being in a band, the energy of being on, I love to perform, the sort of energy of being on stage and performing the travel of, shoestring tours and people's beat up old station wagons, like all of that I spent so many years watching and sort of seeing from 2 feet away. I think I really would have really liked that.
How would you like people to find you?
You mean like online?
Yeah, sure. Online. Not,
I
not,
don't,
I don't,
don't
what's your
knock on.
address? What's your address, please?
I do worry about that a little bit sometimes.
No, no, no. Like I'm talking about people who don't know you, the 5 people who don't know you. How do you want them to find you?
I just left Twitter. It was always Twitter, and I just became so toxic that I just finally, the stuff in Israel and Gaza, I had to leave. So I just ditched Twitter. So I guess Blue Sky, because that's like the new thing, right? So I guess Blue Sky. And I have no idea what my Blue Sky handle is. I think it's just Laurel Snyder, and then like whatever all that Blue Sky's suffix is more complicated. But yeah, I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm on Instagram. And on Instagram, I'm Oh My Lorelei, OHMYLORELEI.
Great.
Which probably I shouldn't be, but that's what I did.
Laurel Snyder, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight. It's really been interesting.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really great chat. There are a lot of things we talked about that I don't usually talk about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, audience, also for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. Remember, if there's someone you'd like to see on this show and you haven't seen them yet, just drop me a line, please. Be sure you push the like button and subscribe, and we will see you next time.